She recalled feeling lost and confused. Her husband was at her side one moment, but gone the next. Those are the harrowing words used to describe the experience of Madeline Astor. She was a first-class passenger, actually 5 months pregnant at the time, who was lowered into a lifeboat and forced to leave her husband behind on the sinking deck of the RMS Titanic. Before we dive into all the bureaucratic paperwork and the heavy legal jargon, we really have to ground ourselves right here, in the raw, visceral human tragedy of April 15, 1912. It was a disaster that completely shocked the globe. Over 1,500 passengers and crew perished in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. But almost as soon as those surviving lifeboats were pulled from the freezing sea, the immediate demanding question became, when the supposedly unsinkable ship actually sinks, who exactly is held responsible? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a monumental and highly controversial legal proceeding that attempted to answer that very question: the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. We're going to use the official historical records and survivor accounts to really understand how the British government investigated one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the human toll. Then, convening the official inquiry. 3, the key testimonies. 4, the Californian controversy. 5, the final verdict. And finally, a legacy of safety. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, the human toll. Before we analyze the cold, hard facts of the court, we absolutely must understand the stakes for the people who actually lived through it. Their experiences varied wildly, but every single one was deeply traumatic. We already mentioned Madeline Astor. She was separated from her incredibly wealthy husband, Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, who perished in the disaster. She actually gave birth to their son exactly 4 months later. Then you have someone like Elsie Bowerman, a British suffragette. She survived in Lifeboat 6 alongside her mother, and get this, she actually continued her planned trip across North America afterwards. And then there's Lucille Carter, rescued in Lifeboat 4, who was completely shocked to find her husband safely aboard the rescue ship Carpathia later on, having seemingly taken a spot on a lifeboat ahead of other women and children. They divorced shortly after. These intensely personal, fragmented experiences really formed the emotional backdrop of the entire trial. Moving on to Section 2. Convening the official inquiry. So the public pressure for answers was immense, which brings us to the sheer macro scale of the British government's legal response. The number 25,000 really says it all. That is the number of questions recorded in the official court records over the course of the investigation. Initiated by the British Board of Trade, these hearings took 42 days, spanning from May all the way to July of 1912. It involved nearly 100 witnesses and cost a staggering £20,000. Actually, at the time, that made it the longest and most detailed court of inquiry in British history. The sheer scale was just completely unprecedented. So, who was actually running this massive show? Well, the inquiry was led by High Court Judge Lord Mersey, acting as the Wreck Commissioner. Sir Rufus Isaacs, the Attorney General, represented the Board of Trade, which is interesting because that's the very organization that had previously certified the Titanic as seaworthy. And Robert Finley represented the White Star Line, the company that owned the ship. Now, you might notice something here. This courtroom was driven heavily by maritime experts, corporate lawyers, and politicians. It really wasn't centered on the victims themselves. Let's jump into Section 3, the key testimonies. With the stage set, the courtroom doors opened and the evidence started pouring in. We all know the story of April 14th and 15th, the collision and the sinking. But the inquiry also heard testimony about something else, a smoldering coal fire. This fire had actually begun in the ship's stores 10 days prior to departure and continued burning right into the maiden voyage. While very little note was taken of it at the time, some modern historians theorize this fire might have actually damaged the whole structural integrity, which could have contributed to how rapidly the ship sank when it hit the ice. And the testimonies themselves? They became an absolute media spectacle. You had Charles Lytler, the most senior surviving officer, and Harold Bride, the wireless operator, giving these incredibly gripping operational accounts. But the true circus happened when aristocrats Sir Cosmo and Lucy Duff Gordon took the stand. They were accused of misconduct for leaving the Titanic in a lifeboat that had 40 seats but was only carrying 12 passengers. High society figures, including the Prime Minister's wife and various aristocrats, literally flocked to the courtroom just to watch this specific scandalous testimony unfold. It was front-page news. Which brings us to Section 4, the Californian controversy. While the Duff Gordons brought the courtroom drama, another piece of testimony brought profound public outrage.
It involved a nearby ship that essentially just watched the Titanic sink. Listen to this stunning quote from Herbert Stone. He was the second officer of the SS Californian. When he was asked if he thought the Titanic, which by the way was actively firing off distress rockets into the night sky, was in trouble, he replied, "I did not think the ship was in distress. If there had been any grounds for supposing the ship would have been in distress, the captain would have expressed it to me." I mean, wow. This highlights a truly shocking level of complacency and deference to authority on a ship that was sitting safely just miles away from the disaster. The crucial takeaway here is the stark night-and-day contrast in maritime leadership. On one hand, you have Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia. He pushed his ship to the absolute mechanical limit, rushing through dangerous ice to rescue the survivors. On the other hand, you have Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian, whose ship remained stationary. And during the inquiry, Lord's own officers actually contradicted his claims on the stand. They portrayed him as a tyrannical and intimidating figure. They were seemingly too afraid to wake him up or challenge him, even as they watched a neighboring ship fire distress rockets. Let's look at Section 5, the final verdict.
So, after 42 days and thousands of questions, Lord Mersey published the final findings on July 30th, 1912. Now, to really understand the British verdict, we kind of have to look at it next to the American inquiry that happened just weeks prior. The American investigation aggressively pointed fingers. They castigated the shipping industry, Captain Smith, and the British Board of Trade for their massive failures. But the British inquiry took a very different tone. It was highly technical, erudite, and honestly, quite protective. It actually cleared Captain Smith of negligence. They concluded that, yeah, traveling at a dangerously fast speed in icy waters was a mistake, but he was just following long-standing industry practice. The British report explicitly stated its goal was to focus on future safety rather than assigning past blame. And finally, Section 6, a legacy of safety. That whole focus on the future, that is exactly why this 1912 legal proceeding still matters to you and me today, because out of this terrible tragedy came the actual foundation of modern maritime safety. The inquiry mandated that ships absolutely must carry adequate lifeboats for every single passenger on board. It required proper, rigorous training for crews so they'd actually know how to man those lifeboats. It implemented mandatory 24/7 wireless watches so a distress call would never again go unheard, and it established incredibly strict rules for navigating through ice. Seriously, if you ever step foot on a modern cruise ship, the safety protocols you rely on were paid for by the findings of this very inquiry. But, the inquiry's legacy isn't without its shadows. Surviving officer Charles Lightoller noted in his memoir, "The Board of Trade had passed that ship as in all respects fit for the sea, hence the whitewash brush." He's highlighting a massive conflict of interest here. Think about it. The Board of Trade was investigating a disaster on a ship they themselves had recently certified as safe. Finding the White Star Line or the board negligent would have unleashed millions in lawsuits. It could have potentially devastated the entire British shipping empire in favor of their French and German competitors. Which leaves us with this final, profound question to consider. By clearing the captain and the company of legal negligence, did the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry truly seek justice for the 1,500 souls lost in the freezing Atlantic? Or was this massive 42-day legal undertaking ultimately just a masterclass in bureaucratic self-preservation to protect the British Empire's dominance of the seas? It's a fascinating look at the balance between truth and power, and I really hope this explainer has given you a whole new perspective on the Titanic's tragic legacy.